What's going on, family? Welcome back to the Cinematic Soul podcast. If you've been following this podcast this season so far, then you probably noticed that over here, we've been moving through music stories in Black cinema. We started with the Five Heartbeats, and then we moved into the Temptations, and from there, we got to the Jacksons and American Dream. And then last week, with my guest, Shani, shout out to Shani Showbiz, we talked about Dreamgirls. And Dreamgirls was interesting because it shows the polished side of the industry, right? It was kind of like the pseudo Motown era where the choreography was clean, the suits were all tailored, the dresses had their shimmy and sparkle, the hair was up, and it was laid, The sound was smoothened out so it can cross over into mainstream radio. And mainstream radio was always what people were pushing for, getting their records over there to the other side. And tonight, I want to step back a little further. Before it was too polished, before everybody crossed over, before the industry figured out how to package Black music for the masses. And we know that's a whole thing in itself. Tonight, we're talking about Cadillac Records. And let me just say, this movie is fascinating to me for a couple of reasons. One, because the history behind Cadillac Records and Chess Records is incredibly important. But two, if I'm being honest, it's important because this movie is a bit on the messy side, if we're being real. Not bad. I'm not saying it's a bad movie because I enjoyed several things about this movie, which I will get into as we go on. So not bad. I didn't hate it. I give it about overall a 7 out of 10, which for a movie that was a hard watch this most recent time is not bad. It was just messy, kind of cluttered, like you can feel that there's a really great film somewhere inside of it, but it's trying to tell so many stories at once that sometimes it kind of loses that footing that you need with movies like this. And before we get into the filmmaking side of things, I want to talk a little bit about the history first, because the history behind this story, Chess Records, is one of the most important chapters in music, especially in rock and roll. When people talk about rock and roll, a lot of times the story starts in, let's say, the wrong place, right? It starts somewhere, but not where it should be starting. They start with Elvis, or they start with the British bands that came later on. But if you really follow the threading of the music going all the way back, the sound that eventually became rock and roll was already happening in places like Chicago in the 1940s and 50s. It was being built by these Black blues musicians. Artists like Muddy Waters, Howlin Wolf, shout out to my dog Howlin Wolf, Little Walter, and Chuck Berry. Now, these weren't just guys who were doing whatever. These weren't just musicians trying to get famous. They were men who carried the blues from the Mississippi Delta up to Chicago during the Great Migration. The Great Migration is a time that needs to be discussed for several reasons. Like for the music, for example, for the people who came. Like, if you go to Chicago now, some people say Chicago people have an accent and a Chicago accent. It's something that I did notice when I left home the first time and came back. I had heard it prior to that, but I was like, that's not a real thing. No, it's not. So when I moved to Florida and I came back to Chicago, I was like, huh. Like listening to certain family members and friends, when they say certain words, you can hear the Southern influence, that drawl, and you realize what happened during the Great Migration. Like, we are all connected through this thing. And that's when something changed. When you think about the Great Migration and the music aspect of it, they plugged those guitars into the amps. They turned the harmonica up a little bit louder. The music got bigger, louder, stronger, electric, and it was vibrant. But suddenly, though, the blues started transforming into something new. And one of the key places where that transition happened was a label called Chess Records. Chess Records is the main focus of the movie Cadillac Records. And let's talk about Chess for a second. So the story of Chess Records, in short, Chess was founded by Leonard Chess and his brother. And in the movie, he's played by Adrian Brody. They don't mention the brother that often, which is one of the problems with the movie. It was like Adrian Brody's character, Leonard, was the only person who was big on Chess Records becoming what it became. But history shows that's not true, like most biopics go. Leonard Chess, though, he was a businessman who saw something in music before the rest of the industry at that time could fully get a grip or understand what it meant for the future of music. And what I find interesting about that, though, is the relationship. You've got two very different motivations happening at the same time between Leonard Chess and his artist. On one side, you've got Chess, who he wants to build a successful business, right? That's his main goal, something to provide to the world, if you will. And then on the other side, you get Muddy Waters, who just wants his music to be heard, but most importantly, respected. That was his big thing. And when these two energies come together, something powerful happens. The records start to sell, the artists start gaining recognition. And for Black musicians at that time, that was big, that was key. And eventually the musicians on the label started driving Cadillacs. He would give them Cadillacs, which is where the name Cadillac Records came from. Now, of course, the real story was more complicated than that. And the movies don't often show the complications the way they need to, because it's not sexy to just say, that happened, without making it a more dramatized version of the truth. Because drama sells, the Hollywood story sells. This movie was pretty successful for that reason. But Chess Records, like I said earlier, had multiple partners. There were even artists who were big on chess that didn't even show up in this movie. And like a lot of music history stories, there were issues with money and contracts, and exploitation is a big one. But even with those, though, with those complications, there's no denying that Chess Records had an impact, an imprint on American music. This was kind of a hard watch. Now, let's talk about the performances in this movie for a second. This is where I got happy, and this is where I was kind of like, the cast overall, though, did a lot of heavy lifting. This script in itself was just okay to me, but the cast, for example, they did what needed to be done. In particular, you've got Jeffrey Wright playing Muddy Waters, and I just got to say about Jeffrey Wright, he really grounds this movie. He's one of those actors who doesn't get enough flowers. He's starting to get them nowadays, but he's been doing this since the 90s. And like many people, for a long time in my life, after I saw Shaft, the 2000 version, I just knew he was a Dominican, a Latino man. Like, there was no way I thought he was mixed with black and white. I just thought he was a Latino. Like, he played that role, Peoples Hernandez, to a T. Like, it was just perfect. And then every role he played after that, before that, playing Basquiat. I saw him in a movie that came out 2 years ago, and he was phenomenal, man. So every time I see him, in Batman even, I just know he's going to give 1010%. And that's something I appreciate as an actor myself, because some actors get in movies and they're just like, oh, whatever, here, take it. This is going to sell. But I feel like he becomes these characters. There's something about that I don't take lightly, or I don't take for granted, because he's an actor who doesn't need to be flashy, right? He doesn't need these big dramatic speeches. He can make them himself. He just becomes these characters in a quiet, believable way. Like his Muddy Waters, for example, it feels like a working musician, a man who understands the power of the music he's making, but he also understands the industry he's working in. And that's a big part about that. Then you've got Mos Def, who played Chuck Berry, and he looked a lot like Chuck Berry did in real life. Like when I saw it, I was surprised, because when I see Mos Def, I think about him being Cabby and Brown Sugar. I think about him and Carmen, the hip hopper, which shout out to Robert Townsend, but that was a nightmare for me. Love them all to death though. So when I see Mos Def, I think about those two movies, and I was like, Chuck Berry, I don't know, man. Sure. And when I saw him on the screen, I was like, you know what I mean? Like, I thought there was Chuck Berry a few times in the movie. Like, he has this kind of cool confidence about him, and that he brought to the role that really fit Chuck Berry's personality in real life. Because if you know anything about Chuck Berry had that swagger. He had that I don't give a damn mentality. That sense that he knew exactly what he was doing. And then, of course, there's Beyonce playing Etta James. As I've stated on the last episode, I love Beyonce, especially nowadays. There's not much she can do wrong to me. And I think vocally, she absolutely delivered as Etta James. She absolutely delivered. Like, I heard those songs because she can sing her ass off in real life. And I was like, damn, she sang those songs very well. Etta James had one of those voices that just sounded like it came straight from her soul. And Beyonce did a very solid job honoring that sound. Acting wise, some people feel like the performance works. Some people, like myself, feel like it doesn't fully capture Etta James's rawness that it needed to. But the music itself definitely landed. So vocally, B, you did your thing. I'm not going to go too crazy on you, but at last, let me go play that song, as a matter of fact. Yo, smokestack lightning. Man, the Howlin' Wolf, as a performer, as an artist, as a character in this movie, I wouldn't be me if I didn't talk about this one scene that really stood out to me. Because watching this again, the studio scene where he say, "Don't talk to him no more. I'm the band leader." Like, the way he captured the essence, the bigness, the scary demeanor of Howlin' Wolf was just incredible, man. I watched that scene on replay about 4 or 5 times this past time, because what that moment captures is presence overall. Like, the Howlin' Wolf was a singer, but he was a presence more than anything to me. Like, when he walks in that room in real life, in the movie, he's a man that stands about 6'3", 6'4". The whole beat, the whole pace of the room just shifts. Everybody locked in. If there was an issue, he told you what was going to happen next. Like in that scene where he came at Chess, at Muddy, Little Walter, they weren't really scaring him, because you can't scare a Howlin' Wolf with these little childish games. Like, he is about that life. And he was about that life in real life. And suddenly the studio just feels less like a workplace, but more like a sacred space. That's one of the things this movie actually really does well in certain moments. Like, it reminds you that this music industry, that this time especially, was more about expression over anything. It wasn't about making everything neat and pretty. The way the Howlin' Wolf expressed himself and the way he made his voice take over, like that power, that strength that you could just hear, is something that is magnificent to me to watch, to hear. If you listen to his songs nowadays, I'm just like, that's a man who knew exactly what his gift was and how to use it, how to express that, share it with the world. Chess Records was these people, working through their pain, their struggles, their lives, all through sound. And that sound was an emotional feeling that is almost indescribable in a way. Pause this right here and go and look up some of these artists. Like, go and look up Etta James, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and listen to 2 or 3 songs. Then come back and tell me what songs hit you the hardest. Because I promise you, at least 1 or 2 of them are going to hit you in the chest. And you're going to be like, oh my God. This was not only important, but this is major. This is critical. This is everything. I can't get enough of it, man. I'm about to go listen to some right now as soon as I get done with this, because those artists just gave their all. And that's something that I really appreciate as an artist myself. So thank you to all of them. Like, man, this is a shorter episode today. Don't have as much time as I would like, but I want to be consistent, with getting the content out to you guys, talking about these movies that I want to discuss with you guys. And this was a movie that I watched, and like I said, it's not my favorite out of the movies I'm going to discuss on this podcast, but I do feel, because of Chess Records, because of the artist, that this is an important movie to discuss with the theme that we're doing this season on the podcast. So before I wrap this up, I want to start a segment, something new here on the show. I want to call it Cinematic Soul Flowers. And the idea is simple. Every now and then, there's somebody in a film, a character, a being, if you will, who deserves their flowers for the work they did. Even if the movie itself isn't a perfect movie, but there aren't really any perfect movies. There are some perfect performances in movies, though. And tonight, the flowers, of course, are going to go to Jeffrey Wright. Like, his performance as Muddy Waters, man, was the emotional backbone of this movie. He played that character with so much patience, with depth, with respect for the man that Muddy Waters was. You can tell he took his time to learn about Muddy Waters and the way he was brought up and why he did, what he stood for. Even through the holes that were in the script, he delivered a put on the master class of acting and showmanship. And without that performance in this movie, I honestly don't even think I would have given it the grade I gave it. It would have probably got like a 5. That's just how much he carried in this movie. Yes, he was the main character, but that doesn't always land if you don't do what needs to be done. And Jeffrey Wright, like always, especially like he did in American Fiction, he just knows how to put his heart, his soul, his foot into that role, into that character. So tonight, these Cinematic Soul Flowers go to Jeffrey Wright. Mr. Jeffrey, thank you. Cheers, my brother, for doing what you do and being exactly who you are. Salute. There was one thing Jeffrey Wright said about Muddy Waters that really stood out to me. He said, if Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll, then Muddy Waters was the god. And that line right there just sums up the entire conversation on on rock and roll, on music history, on Black history. Because rock and roll did not just appear out of thin air, contrary to popular belief. It came from somewhere, and it came from these blues clubs, these Black stories and feelings from Black musicians all over, from the Delta to Chicago to New York. These artists who would eventually shape the entire music industry. Cadillac Records is something that, might not capture every detail of that history perfectly, but it reminds people where the music industry started, where the true beginning was for rock and roll. And sometimes that reminder is more than enough. We are the history. We are why music is what it is today. And we must not forget that. Period. That's Cadillac Records, y'all. And this is the Cinematic Soul. You can follow the podcast on Threads on Instagram at Cinematic Soul Pod. You can follow us on Facebook, on YouTube at Cinematic Soul Pod. Now, the YouTube page, I want to try to keep up to date. I want to put these things out there to grow that audience as well. So if you enjoyed this movie, if you enjoyed this review of the movie, like, follow, subscribe, put a comment down below. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you want me to talk about this season, next season. I want to hear from you all. And with that, I say, thank you all for listening. Stay Black, stay magical, and keep the soul in cinema alive. Peace and love, y'all.